Now I'm going to pull together a lot of what I've been talking about into a single ASP.NET Core web application. I'm going to create a new application, but this time I'll use the project template that implements a lot of the application infrastructure that most real-world full-featured applications need. Just keep in mind that just like the classic ASP.NET applications, you can rip out and replace or modify the infrastructure just about any way you need to make it work for your requirements. Okay, so I'll come up here into File, New Project. And this time I want to select the ASP.NET Core web application that's built using .NET Core. So we're jumping full into .NET Core. And I'll give this a more meaningful name, Test App. And I'll put it in my Learn Now directory there. All right, click on OK, and we get the dialog box for the new ASP.NET Core web application. Now, previously I created a project using the empty template, but this time I'm going to use the web application. So this is going to give a lot of features, and this is just like what happened in classic ASP.NET, at least the last few versions of it, and Visual Studio. I'm going to change the authentication to use individual user accounts. There's lots of support for authentication, including using things like Facebook and Google authentication, but this will have site-specific username and passwords. But I'm mainly doing that just because I want to pull in some additional infrastructure into the application. I could opt to host it in the cloud, but this is going to be deployed to some other server as opposed to Microsoft Azure. And so that's all the settings, and I'll click on OK. And Visual Studio works with the project template to whir and click and clank to build the project structure and populate it with a number of files in the structure of an application that Microsoft essentially feels uses best practices. And they're certainly worth studying. Okay, we get the usual welcome to ASP.NET Core. If I go over here to Solution Explorer, you can see that it's already doing a restore of packages. And in fact, I can click on Output there, and it'll show me what's happening as it restores the packages. And this is a brand new project, so this is going to take a little bit of time for that to all happen. So I'll go ahead and make that a little bit smaller. In the meantime, I can look real quick at Learn What's New in ASP.NET Core. So what's sort of interesting about this is that when I click on that link, it'll go out and load that web page from Microsoft's site. And as you can see, it's the docs.asp.net website. Okay, and so here you can learn and explore different features of ASP.NET. Okay, so enough of that. So I will go ahead and close that window and come back over here to Output. And as you can see, there are a lot of packages that are involved in this full application, supporting pretty much all the features of ASP.NET Core as well as MVC. So this is going to take a little bit of time to run. Oh, and there it finished. So what happened there is that I had previously created an application of this kind on this machine, and so some of the packages were already in the local package cache. So it only needed to download basically the packages that are specific to this application. Okay, and so, but just keep in mind that the first time that you do this on a clean machine with a clean install, it's going to take a bit of time because it's going to need to populate the local package cache with a lot of additional packages that I didn't need to do here. It was redundant. So that's one nice thing about using NuGet. It eliminates a lot of the redundant work of bringing down those packages. Okay, let me get rid of that window there. And there we have the project structure. Okay, before I start getting into the details of the project, I'm going to go ahead and run it. So it's going to use IIS Express. That's the default configuration for the project. So it'll go out and configure everything. Now, if that restore had not completed at this point, it would have to wait for that restore to happen because it needs all those packages that it downloaded in order to be able to run the application. But in this case, the restore was done, and so it goes ahead, runs the application, opens up the default browser, which is Microsoft Edge on this machine. And ultimately it loads the application. So there you can see my application name is Test App, and if you look down in the lower left as I hover over that, you can see that that just goes to the home page. And there's a slider with all kinds of propaganda about Visual Studio. That is in fact the home page. So I can click on that and that page will reload. There's also an About page and a Contact page. And then because I included the authentication for the local authentication, it also includes a page here where I can register an account as well as log into the site, presumably because the site has some sort of content that I'm protecting for certain users. Now just keep in mind that I selected the option for local usernames and passwords that are stored in a local DB database. But there are other options such as using Facebook logins and Google and so forth. And so you can see that there's a link there in the standard page with an article where you can get details about setting up different authentication schemes. Okay, and then there's usual links to register as a new user, forgot the password, and so forth. All right, so again, if you've developed in classic ASP.NET and used the project templates from older versions of ASP.NET, this is going to look basically familiar. The appearance is different, but it's the same sort of app. Behind the scenes, though, the code is quite different. Okay, so that's a sample application. Let's go back here, and I'll go ahead and stop the application. You can see some of the cool diagnostic tools that are included with Visual Studio 2015. Okay, so let me pin open Solution Explorer. Now, in the project structure, there is a lot here. This really is the beginnings of a reasonably complex, reasonably realistic application. I'm going to be going through a lot of this stuff in great detail in the second part of this course when we really dive down into ASP.NET Core. But what I want to do here is relate the pieces, the structure of the application, to what I've shown you earlier in this course in that basic .NET Core and ASP.NET Core MVC application that I created pretty much manually. Okay, so we have the global.json file, not very interesting here. We have properties with launch settings, and if you open that up, we looked at a basic version earlier, but this version is set up to use IIS, and specifically to use IIS Express when running the application within Visual Studio. And so you can see the various settings that are available, as well as one environment variable that indicates that I'm running in the development environment. And that'll become relevant a little bit later, because what's really nice is that you can actually include code very easily and simply, even easier than in older versions of .NET and Visual Studio, in order to be able to test the environment to see if you're in a development or production environment, and then execute different code. And that can be a really handy technique to do. Something that you could do in older versions, but it was a little bit more involved and trickier. Okay, so we have the launch settings there. References, you'll find that it has a reference to the .NET Core app. If I built this application using the template that used the full .NET framework, this would have different references because it's based on a different framework. And if you drill down into that, you can see all of the different packages that are involved in supporting the .NET Core system there. Okay, I briefly mentioned earlier in the course www.root, and what this does is it's the location where you should put all of your static files. So if you drill down into this, you can see I have a site CSS that's already created, including a minified version of it. There's a few images. Those are those banner images on the slider that came across. A little bit of JavaScript for the site, as well as a minified version of it. A lib with a few additional things, and as you can see, it uses Bootstrap and jQuery validation. Now keep in mind that this is what came in because I used the non-empty template. I don't get all this stuff with the empty template. So I kind of envisioned that for your first couple real projects, you probably want to use this template, get this stuff, probably worthwhile learning Bootstrap and jQuery if you don't already know about them, But these are not integral to .NET Core in any way, shape, or form. You can use any tools that you want, any frameworks, JavaScript frameworks, themes, and so forth that you want to. You'll have to add them all manually, but the nice thing here is that a lot of the popular ones have NuGet packages, and so you just reference and download the NuGet package, and it automatically sets everything up for you. So that's another real nice feature of using NuGet. Okay, then we have some dependencies. Bower is a package manager. Again, there's various other package managers that you can use. But what this does is it manages things like HTML and CSS and JavaScript and images and packages them up for you. And you can configure it using the tools within Bower. That's a whole separate course. That's a very complex topic. Just keep in mind that this project template uses it by default. You don't need to at all. Okay, then we have the usual controllers. This is a sample project, and I brought in the authentication, so it has an account controller. It also has a home controller and a manage controller. All right, then there's a data folder here. I'm not going to talk about this, but it gets into Entity Framework. And then I have various models. These are essentially classes that, well, they are classes that implement different view models that are used by MVC. Again, I'm not going to get into the detail of that here, but basically these are the objects that will provide data to the views of the application. And best practice is to have a view model, have a broad basic model to interact with your data store, whatever it might be, whether it's SQL Server or LocalDB or MySQL or whatever. But then have view models that provide the data for each view specifically. So you're not transferring too much data and have the view have to do more work than it needs to do to render the page to the user. Okay, and then we have views. So this is pretty standard for an ASP.NET MVC. Again, it uses the convention over configuration to have a views folder, so MVC knows by default to look for views in these folders. And we have one for each of the controllers as well as a shared. And this is all the same as classic ASP.NET. What's a bit different, however, is if I go down here into account and let me open up register. So this is that page that I briefly showed you, that where a user can register a new account. I just wanted to show you this fairly briefly. We're going to get into this in much more detail in the second part of the course. But this is heavily based on tag helpers instead of HTML helpers. So rather than having @ and HTML something or other, notice that all of the tag helpers are implemented using attributes on the different elements. So rather than having this context switch between HTML and essentially C#, embedded little nuggets of C# that harkens back to classic ASP, not ASP.NET, but old classic ASP from really right around the turn of the millennium. It's what ASP.NET replaced. That was kind of messy because you constantly had this context switch. Very cool system, but it did harken back to ASP. But now we're hooking into the HTML5 support for better support for attributes. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that briefly. Again, it's using tag helpers for the most part instead of HTML helpers. Okay, so now let's get into some of the more interesting stuff as far as what I was showing you earlier in the course. I mentioned that for the most part, configuration data is now stored in JSON files. We have the project.json, and I'll talk about that momentarily, but we also have a couple of custom configuration files, including app settings. So when I open that up, notice that there isn't a huge amount there, but this is a handy place to put in your application specific configuration data. Okay, and as you can see, there are some settings there. Application Insights is essentially a telemetry feature of .NET applications that you can choose to use or not use. You can have connection strings. Because I included the authentication data, there's a connection string to the local DB in order so that's a location where it will store the data when users start registering. And then by default there's some logging and there's some settings in order to configure that. But you can go ahead and add additional settings here, and there's an API that you can use in order to automatically bring these into your application and make them available. So it's not a feature that's new really, because there was support for these kinds of application configuration settings in classic ASP.NET. But what's new is just how slick and simple it is, easy to use, as well as using the JSON format. Okay, so appsettings.json is where you should add your application-specific settings, as has already been done in part in order to support the features, the infrastructure within this application. Okay, then there's bundleconfig.json, and this is where you can put, well, where the default application puts the settings to configure the bundling and minification for the project. Okay, so again, I'm not going to get into the details here, but this is essentially just a separate configuration file. And then during startup, you would need to pull this configuration file in along with appsettings.json. Okay, I'm going to come back to program.cs, and then here's the project.json file. All right, so this is a bit of a mixed bag. For the most part, you're probably going to need to manually edit this at times, because keep in mind this is where there's the different sections of the file that implement different features of .NET Core. And I covered the different features earlier in the course, but here you can see something that's approaching more of a real world kind of an application. So as you can see, there's a number of dependencies here. Including authentication, diagnostics. Here's the dependency on MVC itself, as well as Razor, the routing that's necessary, Entity Framework, that's the Entity Framework core that this application uses. Entity Framework core is in a similar state of development as .NET Core, in that it is not fully baked yet. It's usable, but it doesn't have all the features of the current full version of Entity Framework that's been out for quite some time. Okay, but I'll be talking more about Entity Framework in the second part of the course. Okay, and then various extensions and so forth. There's support for tools. Notice that the framework is based on the .NET Core. Once again, there's some build options. Once again, we have that preserve compilation context that's necessary for MVC applications, and various other settings there. Okay. So again, that's more of a real-world version of project.json. And I can expand this, and because Visual Studio completed the .NET restore of the NuGet packages, we have this project.lock.json file. And so this has all of the specific versions of all the packages, as well as various versions and settings and so forth. Again, you generally are not going to want to modify this file directly. Instead, modify project.json, and then you also don't need to put this into source control. You do need to put project.json, but not the lock file. Okay, then here's the project readme. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that because it's just kind of noise. Okay, and I'll come back to startup when I talk about program.cs in just a moment. And then we also have the web.config file. So this is kind of one of the last remnants of ASP, classic ASP. It's necessary in order to essentially allow this application to interact with IIS. But that's all you need. Probably don't need to modify it, but there may be some scenarios where you do. Okay, so now let's talk really about the fun part. So program.cs and by extension startup.cs. So as you can see, this is just console application. Has a main entry point, just like the simple application that I created earlier in the course. And as you can see, all this does is it news up a web host builder. Kestrel uses the content root to identify the current directory, which is necessary for MVC to find the different files in the location it expects. It's using IIS integration, so that's what we needed in order to hook in with IIS Express locally. And then this is the use startup method that I need to create a custom startup class and then build it and then run it. And so this is hoisting up the web server and the application and running the application. Okay, so same kind of stuff, slight variation on the settings here, but it's specific to the kind of application that I created. Now, the really interesting part is in startup.cs. Here's where you define many of the parameters of your application. So we have the startup class. Remember, that's what I used in program.cs, so it needs to be called startup in the same namespace. And here is the constructor for the class. And what's interesting here is you can see that this is where it's setting up the configuration files. So it's newing up a configuration builder, and amongst other things, adding the JSON file that's appsettings.json, which is one of the configuration files that this project template creates by default. And then you can add, if you have any custom configuration files, you can add those as well. And here shows how easy it is to include code based on whether or not you're in the development environment or not. This iHosting environment object or interface has this test for whether it's not development. And so you can include additional things based on whether it's development or release or whatever environment you need custom code for. Okay, and then you just add the environmental variables and then build it, and you have the configuration, you have access to that, and all your configurations are set. Okay, then here's configuration services. And this is where you add services to the container. So if you're using application insights, as this project template does, you need to set that up. Add DB context. This is setting up entity framework. Add identity to use the identity services for authentication. And then adding MVC. Okay, so that's the different middleware that's involved within running this application. Okay, and then here's the configure method. And as you can see, we're setting up logging, setting up application insights, testing whether or not it's development. And in this case, if it is the development environment, it's going to use the developer exception page, which includes extra information about any exceptions that are thrown, and so forth. Otherwise, if it's not the development environment, it's going to use this exception handler, which is a page that's defined within the project. Fairly standard error page. Okay, and then finally we come down to use MVC. And here, unlike the sample application that I created earlier in the course, this is defining the default route here as part of the call to use MVC. And you're not limited to a single route. You can set up multiple routes, do all basically the same kind of stuff that you can do with routing in classic ASP.NET. But in this case, the default route is controller name, or the default route is controller action user ID. And in this case, the code includes the default controller and the default action directly within the route definition. And as you can see, the ID is optional, and so it's using the question mark to indicate that that might be missing. And so if it is missing, this route will still match if there's a controller and an action matched. Okay, so there you have a relatively full-featured program.cs and startup.cs files in what approaches more of a real-world kind of an application. So as you can see, there's a lot of services and configuration and other features that you have control of. All of this code was created as part of the project template for an ASP.NET Core application using the .NET Core, but you have control. You can add additional middleware, you can add additional configuration files, you can take stuff away if you're not using particular things. If you decide that you're going to build your own identity system, you can get rid of use identity and put some other class in there. So it really is a pretty marvelous, flexible, very powerful system for controlling how this application works. And keep in mind that a lot of this was implemented in these particular ways in order to support running ASP.NET Core applications on not just on Windows, but on Linux and Mac OS as well.